There were two important Saxon leaders in Hrokir. Like us, the Saxons had chiefs and lesser kings. Indeed, they had tribes, and some of the tribes did not even call themselves Saxons, but claimed to be Angles or Jutes. But we called them all Saxons, and knew they only possessed two important kings, and those two leaders were called Ael and Cerdic. They hated each other. Ael, of course, was then the famous one. He called himself the Bretwalder, which in the Saxon tongue meant the ruler of Britain, and his land stretched from south of the Thames to the border of distant Elmet. His rival was Cerdic, whose territory lay on Britain's southern coast, and whose only borders were with Ael's lands and Dumnonia. Of the two kings, Ael was older, richer in land, and stronger in warriors, and that made Ael our chief enemy. Defeat Ael, we believed, and Cerdic would inevitably fall afterwards. Prince Murig of Gwent, arrayed in his toga and with a ludicrous bronze wreath perched atop his thin, pale brown hair, had proposed a different strategy at the Council of War. With his usual diffidence and mock humility, he had suggested we make an alliance with Cerdic.
"Let him fight for us," Murig said. "Let him attack Ael from the south while we strike from the west. I am, I know, no strategist."
He paused to simper, inviting one of us to contradict him, but we all bit our tongues.
"But it seems clear, even surely to the meanest of intelligences, that to fight one enemy is better than two."
"But we have two enemies," Arthur said plainly.
"Indeed we do. I have made myself master of that point, Lord Arthur. But my point, if you can seize it in turn, is to make one of those enemies our friend." He clasped his hands together and blinked at Arthur. "An ally," Murig added, in case Arthur had still not understood him.
"Cerdic," Sagramore growled in his atrocious British, "has no honor. He will break an oath as easily as a magpie breaks a sparrow's egg. I will make no peace with him."
"You fail to understand," Murig protested.
"I will make no peace with him." Sagramore interrupted the prince, speaking the words very slowly, as though he spoke to a child. Murig reddened and went silent. The Edling of Gwent was scared half to death of the tall Numidian warrior. And no wonder, for Sagramore's reputation was as fearsome as his looks. The Lord of the Stones was a tall man, very thin and quick as a whip. His hair and face were as black as pitch, and that long face, cross-hatched from a lifetime of war, bore a perpetual scowl that hid a droll and even generous character. Sagramore, despite his imperfect grasp of our language, could keep a campfire enthralled for hours with his tales of far-off lands. But most men only knew him as the fiercest of all Arthur's warriors. The implacable Sagramore, who was terrible in battle and sombre out of it, while the Saxons believed he was a black fiend sent from their underworld. I knew him well enough and liked him. Indeed, it had been Sagramore who had initiated me into Mithras's service, and Sagramore who had fought at my side all that long day in Lugvale.
"He's got himself a big Saxon girl now," Killock had whispered to me at the council. "Tall as a tree and with hair like a haystack. No wonder he's so thin."
"Your 3 wives keep you solid enough," I said, poking him in his substantial ribs.
"I pick them for the way they cook, Derval, not the way they look."
"You have something to contribute, Lord Killock?" Arthur asked.
"Nothing, cousin,"
Killock responded cheerfully. "Then we shall continue," Arthur said. He asked Sagramore what chance there was of Cerdic's men fighting for Ael, and the Numidian, who had guarded the Saxon frontier all winter, shrugged and said that anything was possible with Cerdic. He had heard, he said, that the two Saxons had met and exchanged gifts, but no one had reported that an actual alliance had been made. Sagramore's best guess was that Cerdic would be content to let Ael be weakened, and that while the Dumnonian army was about that business, he would attack along the coast in an effort to capture Durnovaria.
"If we were at peace with him,"
Murig tried again. "We won't be," King Keenaglass said curtly. And Murig,
outranked by the only king at the council, went quiet again.
There is one last thing, Sagramore warned us. The Sis have dogs now. Big dogs.
He spread his hands to show the huge size of the Saxon war dogs. We had all heard of these beasts, and we feared them. It was said that the Saxons released the dogs just seconds before the shield walls clashed, and that the beasts were capable of tearing huge holes in the wall, into which the enemy spearmen poured. "I will deal with the dogs," Merlin said. It was the only contribution he made to the council, but the calm, confident statement relieved some worried men. Merlin's unexpected presence with the army was contribution enough, for his possession of the cauldron made him, even for many of the Christians, a figure of more awesome power than ever. Not that many understood the purpose of the cauldron, but they were pleased that the druid had declared his willingness to accompany the army. With Arthur at our head and Merlin on our side, how could we lose? Arthur made his dispositions. King Lancelot, he said, with the spearmen of Siluria and a detachment of men from Dumnonia, would guard the southern frontier against Cerdic. The rest of us would assemble at Caer Ambra and march due east along the valley of the Thames. Lancelot made a show of being reluctant to be thus separated from the main army that would have to fight Ael, but Kilhuch, hearing the orders, shook his head in wonder.
"He's skipping out of battle again, Derval,"
he whispered to me. "Not if Cerdic attacks him," I said. Kilhuch glanced across at Lancelot, who was flanked by the twins Dinas and Lavain.
"And he's staying near his protectress, isn't he?"
Kilhuch said.
"Mustn't stray too far from Guinevere, else he has to stand up by himself."
I did not care. I was only relieved that Lancelot and his men were not in the main army. It was enough to face the Saxons, without worrying about Tanaber's grandsons or a Silurian knife in my back. And so we marched. It was a ragged army of contingents from 3 British kingdoms, while some of our more distant allies had still not arrived. There were men promised to us from Elmet, and even from Kernau, but they would follow us along the Roman road that ran southeast from Corinium, and then east towards London. London. The Romans had called it Londinium, and before that it had been plain Londo, which Merlin once told me meant a wild place. And now it was our goal, the once great city that had been the largest in all Rome's Britain, and which now lay decaying amidst Ael's stolen lands. Sagramore had once led a famous raid into the old city, and he had found its British inhabitants cowed by their new masters. But now, we hoped, we would take them back. That hope spread like wildfire through the army, though Arthur consistently denied it. Our task, he said, was to bring the Saxons to battle, and not be lured by the ruins of a dead city. But in this, Arthur was opposed by Merlin. "I'm not coming to see a handful of dead Saxons," he told me scornfully. "What use am I in killing Saxons?" "Well, every use, Lord," I told him. "Your magic frightens the enemy." "Don't be absurd, Derval. Any fool can hop about in front of an army making faces and hurling curses. Frightening Saxons isn't skilled work. Even those ludicrous druids of Lancelot's could just about manage that. Not that they're real druids." "Well, they're not." "Of course they're not. To be a real druid, you have to study. You have to be examined. You have to satisfy other druids that you know your business. And I never heard of any druid examining Dinas and Lavain. Unless Tanaber's did. And what kind of druid was he? Not a very good one, plainly, else he'd never have let you live. I do deplore inefficiency." "They can make magic, Lord," I said. "Make magic?" He hooted at that. "One of the wretches produces a thrush's egg, and you think that's magic? Thrushes do it all the time. Now, if he'd made a sheep's egg, I'd take some notice." "He produced a star, too, Lord." "Derval! What an absurdly credulous man you are," he exclaimed. "A star made of scissors and parchment. Don't worry. I heard about that star, and your precious Kynwyn isn't in any danger. Nimue and I made sure of that by burying 3 skulls. You don't need to know the details, but you can rest assured that if those frauds go anywhere near Kynwyn, they'll be changed into grass snakes. Then they can lay eggs forever. I thanked him for that, then asked him just why he was accompanying the army, if not to help us against AL. Because of the scroll, of course, he told me, and patted a pocket of his dirty black robe to show me the scroll was safe. Calethin's scroll? I asked. Is there another? He countered. Calethin's scroll was the treasure Merlin had brought from Innistribes, and in his eyes it was as valuable as all the treasures of Britain. And no wonder, for the secret of those treasures was described in the ancient document. Druids were forbidden to write anything down, because they believed that to record a spell was to destroy the writer's power to work the magic, and thus all their lore and rites and knowledge were handed down by voice alone. Yet the Romans, before they attacked Innismon, had so feared the British religion that they had suborned a druid named Calethin, and had persuaded him to dictate all he knew to a Roman scribe. And Calethin's traitorous scroll had thus preserved all the ancient knowledge of Britain. Much of it, Merlin once told me, had been forgotten in the passing centuries, for the Romans had persecuted the Druids cruelly, and much of the old knowledge had vanished into time. But now, with the scroll, he could recreate that lost power. And the scroll, I ventured, mentions London. My, how curious you are, Merlin mocked me. But then, perhaps because it was a fine day and he was in a sunny mood, he relented. The last treasure of Britain is in London, he said. Or it was, he added hastily. It's buried there. Now, I thought of giving you a spade and letting you dig the thing up, but you were bound to make a mess of it. Just look at what you did on Innismon. Outnumbered and surrounded, indeed. Unforgivable. So I decided to do it myself. I have to find where it's buried first, of course, and that could be difficult. And is that, Lord, I asked, why you brought the dogs? For Merlin and Nimue had collected a mangy pack of snapping mongrels that now accompanied the army. Merlin sighed. Allow me, Derval, he said, to give you some advice. You do not buy a dog and bark yourself. I know the purpose of the dogs. Nimue knows their purpose, and you do not. That is how the gods intended it to be. Do you have any more questions? Or may I now enjoy this morning's walk? He lengthened his stride, thumping his big black staff into the turf with each emphatic step. The smoke of great beacons welcomed us once we had passed Clever. Those fires were the enemy's signals that we were in sight, and whenever a Saxon saw such a plume of smoke, he was under orders to waste the land. The grain stores were emptied, the houses were burned, and the livestock driven away. And always AL withdrew, staying ever a day's march ahead of us, and thus tempting us forward into that wasted land. Wherever the road passed through woodland, it would be blocked by trees. And sometimes, as our men labored to pull the felled trunks out of the way, an arrow or spear would crash through the leaves to snatch a life. Or else one of the big Saxon war dogs would come leaping and slavering out of the undergrowth. But they were the only attacks AL made, and we never once saw his shield wall. Back he went, and forward we marched, and each day the enemy's spears or dogs would snatch a life or two. Much more damage was done to us by disease. We had found the same thing before Lugvale, that whenever a large army gathered, so the gods plagued it with sickness. The sick slowed us terribly. For if they could not march, they had to be laid in a safe place and guarded by spearmen to keep them from the Saxon war bands that prowled all about our flanks. We would see those enemy bands by day as distant, ragged figures, while every night their fires flickered on our horizon. Yet it was not the sick that slowed us the most, but rather the sheer ponderousness of moving so many men. It was a mystery to me why 30 spearmen could cover an easy 20 miles on a relaxed day,
But an army of 20 times that number, even trying hard, was lucky to cover 8 or 9. Our markers were the Roman stones planted on the verge that recorded the number of miles to London. And after a while I refused to look at them, for fear of their depressing message. The ox wagons also slowed us. We were equipped with 40 capacious farm wagons that carried our food and spare weapons, and those wagons lumbered at a snail's pace in the army's rear. Prince Murig had been given command of that rearguard, and he fussed over the wagons, counted them obsessively, and forever complained that the spearmen ahead were marching too fast. Arthur's famed horsemen led the army. There were 50 of them now, all mounted on the big shaggy horses that were bred deep inside Dumnonia. Other horsemen, who did not wear the mail armor of Arthur's band, ranged ahead as our scouts, and sometimes those men failed to return, though we would always find their severed heads waiting for us on the road as we advanced. The main body of the army was composed of 500 spearmen. Arthur had decided to take no levies with him, for such farmers rarely carried adequate weapons. So we were all oath-sworn warriors, and all carried spears and shields, and most possessed swords too. Not every man could afford a sword, but Arthur had sent orders throughout Dumnonia that every household possessing a sword which was not already sworn to the army's service should surrender the weapon, and the 80 blades so collected had been distributed among his army. Some men, a few, carried captured Saxon war axes, though others, like myself, disliked the weapon's clumsiness. And to pay for all this? To pay for the swords and new spears and new shields and wagons and oxen and flour and boots and banners and bridles and cooking pots and helmets and cloaks and knives and horseshoes and salted meat? Arthur laughed when I asked him. "You must thank the Christians, Derval," he said. "They yielded more," I asked. "I thought that udder was dry." "It is now," he said grimly. "But it's astonishing how much their shrines yielded when we offered their guardians martyrdom. And it's even more astonishing how much we've promised to repay them." "Did we ever repay Bishop Sansom?" I asked. His monastery at Inniswydren had provided the fortune that had purchased Ael's peace during the autumn campaign that had ended at Lugvale. Arthur shook his head. "And he keeps reminding me of that." "The bishop," I said carefully, "seems to have made new friends." Arthur laughed at my attempt at tact. "He's Lancelot's chaplain. Our dear bishop, it seems, cannot be kept down. Like an apple in a water barrel, he just bobs up again." "And he's made his peace with your wife," I observed. "I like to see folk resolve their arguments," he said mildly. "But Bishop Sansom does have strange allies these days. Guinevere tolerates him, Lancelot lifts him, and Morgan defends him. How about that? Morgan!" He was fond of his sister, and it pained him that she was so estranged from Merlin. She ruled Inniswydren with a fierce efficiency, almost as if to demonstrate to Merlin that she was a more suitable partner for him than Nimue. But Morgan had long lost the battle to be Merlin's chief priestess. She was valued by Merlin, Arthur said, but she wanted to be loved. And who, Arthur asked me sadly, could ever love a woman so scarred and shriveled and disfigured by fire? "Merlin was never her lover," Arthur told me, "though she pretended he was. And he never minded the pretense, for the more folk think him odd, the happier he is. But in truth, he can't stand the sight of Morgan without her mask. She's lonely, Derval." So it was no wonder that Arthur was glad for his maimed sister's friendship with Bishop Sansom, though it puzzled me how the fiercest proponent of Christianity in Dumnonia could be such friends with Morgan, who was a pagan priestess of famous power. The MSwarlord, I thought, was like a spider making a very strange web. His last web had tried to catch Arthur, and it had failed. So who was Sansom busy weaving for now? We heard no news from Dumnonia after the last of our allies joined us. We were cut off now, surrounded by Saxons, though the last news from home had been reassuring. Cerdic had made no move against Lancelot's troops, nor, it was thought, had he moved east to support Ael. The last allied troops to join us were a war band from Kernau, led by an old friend who came galloping up the column to find me, then slid off his horse to trip and fall at my feet. It was Tristan, Prince and Edling of Kernau, who picked himself up, beat the dust off his cloak, then embraced me.
You can relax, Derval, he said. The warriors of Kernau have arrived. All will be well. I laughed. You look well, Lord Prince. He did, too. I am free of my father, he explained. He has let me out of the cage. He probably hopes a Saxon will bury an axe in my skull. He made a grotesque face in imitation of a dying man, and I spat to avert evil. Tristan was a handsome, well-made man, with black hair, a forked beard, and long moustaches. He had a sallow skin and a face that often looked sad, but which today was filled with happiness. He had disobeyed his father by bringing a small band of men to Lug Vale, for which act, we had heard, he had been confined to a remote fortress on Kernau's northern coast all winter. But King Mark had now relented and released his son for this campaign. "We're family now," Tristan explained. "Family? My dear father," he said ironically, "has taken a new bride, Ial of Brasiliand." Brasiliand was the remaining British kingdom in Armorica, and it was ruled by Budic ap Camran, who was married to Arthur's sister Anna, which meant that Ial was Arthur's niece. "What's this?" I asked. "Your sixth stepmother?" "Seventh," Tristan said. "And she's only 15 summers old. And father must be 50 at least. Yeah, I'm already 30, he added gloomily. "And not married?" "Not yet. But my father marries enough for both of us. Poor Ial. Give her 4 years, Derval, and she'll be dead like the rest. But he's happy enough for now. He's wearing her out like he wears them all out." He put an arm round my shoulders. "And I hear you're married." "Well, not married, but well harnessed." "To the legendary Kynwyn?" He laughed. "Well done, my friend, well done. One day I'll find my own Kynwyn. May it be soon, Lord Prince." "It'll have to be. I'm getting old. Ancient. I saw a white hair the other day. Here, in my beard." He poked at his chin. "See it?" he asked anxiously. "It?" I mocked him. "You look like a badger." There might have been 3 or 4 grey strands among the black, but that was all. Tristan laughed, then glanced at a slave who was running beside the road with a dozen leashed dogs. "Emergency rations?" he asked me. "Merlin's magic, and he won't tell me what they're for." The druid's dogs were a nuisance. They needed food we could not spare, kept us awake at night with their howling, and fought like fiends against the other dogs that accompanied our men. On the day after Tristan joined us, we reached Pontis, where the road crossed the Thames on a wondrous stone bridge made by the Romans. We'd expected to find the bridge broken, but our scouts reported it whole, and, to our astonishment, it was still whole when our spearmen reached it. That was the hottest day of the march. Arthur forbade anyone to cross the bridge until the wagons had closed up on the main body of the army, and so our men sprawled by the river as they waited. The bridge had 11 arches, 2 on either bank, where they lifted the roadway onto the 7-arch span that crossed the river itself. Tree trunks and other floating debris had piled against the upstream side of the bridge, so that the river to the west was wider and deeper than to the east, and the makeshift dam made the water race and foam between the stone pilings. There was a Roman settlement on the far bank, a group of stone buildings surrounded by the remnants of an earth embankment, while at our end of the bridge a great tower guarded the road that passed beneath its crumbling arch, on which a Roman inscription still existed. Arthur translated it for me, telling me that the Emperor Adrian had ordered the bridge to be built. "Imperator," I said, peering up at the stone plaque. "Does that mean emperor?"
It does.
And an emperor is above a king? I asked.
An emperor is a lord of kings, Arthur said.
The bridge had made him gloomy. He clambered about its landward arches, then walked to the tower and laid a hand on its stones as he peered up at the inscription.
Suppose you and I wanted to build a bridge like this, he said to me. How would we do it?
I shrugged. Make it from timber, Lord. Good elm pilings, the rest from split oak. He grimaced.
And would it still be standing when our great-great-grandchildren live?
Well, they can build their own bridges, I suggested.
He stroked the tower. We have no one who can dress stone like this. No one who knows how to sink a stone pier into a riverbed. No one who even remembers how. We're like men with a treasure hoard, Derval. And day by day it shrinks, and we don't know how to stop it, or how to make more.
He glanced back and saw the first of Murig's wagons appearing in the distance. Our scouts had probed deep into the woods that grew either side of the road, and they had reported neither sight nor smell of any Saxons. But Arthur was still suspicious.
If I was them, I'd let our army cross, then attack the wagons, he said.
So instead, he had decided to throw an advance guard over the bridge, cross the wagons into what remained of the settlement's decaying earth wall, and only then bring the main part of his army over the river. My men formed the advance guard. The land beyond the river was less thickly wooded, and though some of the remaining trees grew close enough to hide a small army, no one appeared to challenge us. The only sign of the Saxons was a severed horse's head waiting at the bridge's center. None of my men would pass it until Numui came forward to dispel its evil. She merely spat at the head. Saxon magic, she said, was feeble stuff, and once its evil had been dissipated, Issa and I heaved the thing over the parapet. My men guarded the earth wall as the wagons and their escort crossed. Galahad had come with me, and the two of us poked about the buildings inside the wall. Saxons, for some reason, were loath to use Roman settlements, preferring their own timber and thatched halls, though some folk had been living here till recently, for the hearths contained ashes and some of the floors were swept clean. It could be our people, Galahad said, for plenty of Britons lived among the Saxons, many of them as slaves, but some as free people who had accepted the foreign rule. The buildings appeared to have been barracks once, but there were also two houses, and what I took to be a huge granary, which, when we pushed open its broken door, proved to be a beast house where cattle were sheltered overnight to protect them from wolves. The floor was a deep mire of straw and dung that smelt so rank that I would have left the building there and then, but Galahad saw something in the shadows at its far end, and so I followed him across the wet, viscous floor. The building's far end was not a straight gabled wall, but was broken by a curved apse. High on the apse's stained plaster, and barely visible through the dust and dirt of the years, was a painted symbol that looked like a big X, on which was superimposed a P. Galahad stared up at the symbol and made the sign of the cross. "It used to be a church, Derval," he said in wonder. "It stinks," I said. He gazed reverently at the symbol. "There were Christians here." "Not any longer." I shuddered at the overwhelming stench and batted helplessly at the flies that buzzed around my head. Galahad did not care about the smell. He thrust his spear butt into the compacted mass of cow dung and rotting straw, and finally succeeded in uncovering a small patch of the floor. What he found only made him work harder, until he had revealed the upper part of a man, depicted in small mosaic tiles. The man wore robes like a bishop, had a sun halo round his head, and in one uplifted hand was carrying a small beast with a skinny body and a great shaggy head. "St. Mark and his lion," Galahad told me. "I thought lions were huge beasts," I said, disappointed. "Sagramor says they're bigger than horses and fiercer than bears." I peered at the dung-smeared beast. "Well, that's just a kitten." "It's a symbolic lion," he reproved me. He tried to clear more of the floor, but the filth was too old, thick, packed, and glutinous. "One day," he said, "I shall build a great church like this. A huge church. A place where a whole people can gather before their God. And when you're dead," I pulled him back towards the door, "some bastard will winter 10 herds of cattle in it, and be thankful to you." He insisted on staying 1 minute more, and while I held his shield and spear, he spread his arms wide and offered a new prayer in an old place. "It's a sign from God," he said excitedly, as he at last followed me back into the sunshine. "We shall restore Christianity to Rogier, Derval. It's a sign of victory." It might have been a sign of victory to Galahad, but that old church was almost the cause of our defeat. The next day, as we advanced east towards London, that was now so tantalizingly close, Prince Murig stayed at Pontis. He sent the wagons on with most of their escort, but kept 50 men back to clear the church of its cloying filth. Murig, like Galahad, was much moved by the existence of that ancient church, and decided to rededicate the shrine to its god. And so he had his spearmen lay aside their war gear and clear the building of its dung and straw, so that the priests who accompanied him could say whatever prayers were needed to restore the building's sanctity. And while the rearguard forked dung, the Saxons who had been following us came over the bridge. Murig escaped. He had a horse, but most of the dung sweepers died, and so did 2 of the priests. And then the Saxons stormed up the road and caught the wagons. The remnant of the rearguard put up a fight, but they were outnumbered, and the Saxons outflanked them, overran them, and began slaughtering the plodding oxen, so that one by one the wagons were stopped and fell into the enemy's hands. By now we had heard the commotion. The army stopped as Arthur's horsemen galloped back towards the sound of the killing. None of those horsemen was properly equipped for battle, for it was simply too hot for a man to ride in armor all day. Yet their sudden appearance was enough to stampede the Saxons. But the damage had already been done. 18 of the 40 wagons had been immobilized, and without oxen, they would have to be abandoned. Most of the 18 had been plundered, and barrels of our precious flour had been spilt onto the road. We salvaged what flour we could, and wrapped it in cloaks, but the bread it would bake would be poor stuff, and riddled with dust and twigs. Even before the raid, we had been cutting down on rations, reckoning we had enough for 2 more weeks. But now, because most of the food had been in the rearward vehicles, we faced the prospect of abandoning the march in just 1 week. And even then, there would be barely enough food remaining to see us safe back to Chleva or Caer Ambra. "There are fish in the river," Murig pointed out. "Gods, not fish again," Killick grumbled, recalling the privations of the last days of Innistribes. "There are not fish enough to feed an army," Arthur answered angrily. He would have liked to have shouted at Murig, to have stripped his stupidity bare. But Murig was a prince, and Arthur's sense of what was proper would never let him humiliate a prince. If it had been Killick or I who had divided the rearguard and exposed the wagons, Arthur would have lost his temper. But Murig's birth protected him. We were at a council of war, north of the road, which here ran straight across a dull, grassy plain that was studded with clumps of trees and with straggling banks of gorse and hawthorn. All the commanders were present, and dozens of lesser men crowded close to hear our discussions. Murig, of course, denied all responsibility. If he had been given more men, he said, the disaster would never have happened. "Besides," he said, "and you will forgive me for pointing this out, though I would have thought it an obvious point that should hardly need my explication, no success can attend an army that ignores God." "So why did God ignore us?" Sagramore asked. Arthur hushed the Numidian. "What is done, he said. "What happens next is our business here." But what happened next was up to Ael, rather than to us. He had won the first victory, though it was possible he did not know the extent of that triumph. We were miles inside his territory, and we faced starvation
unless we could trap his army, destroy it, and so break out into land that had not been stripped of supplies. Our scouts brought us deer, and once in a while they came across some cattle or sheep, but such delicacies were rare, and not nearly sufficient to make up for the lost flour and dried meat. "He has to defend London, surely," Keenaglass suggested. Sagramore shook his head. "London is populated by Britons," he said. "The Saxons don't like it there. He'll let us have London." "There'll be food in London," Keenaglass said. "But how long will it last, Lord King?" Arthur asked. "And if we take it with us, what do we do? Wander forever, hoping Ael will attack?" He stared at the ground, his long face hardened by thought. Ael's tactics were clear enough now. The Saxon would let us march and march, and his men would always be ahead of us to sweep our path clean of food. And once we were weakened and dispirited, the Saxon horde would swarm around us. "What we must do," Arthur said, "is draw him onto us." Murig blinked rapidly. "How?" he inquired, in a tone suggesting Arthur was being ridiculous. The druids who accompanied us, Merlin, Iorwerth, and 2 others from Powys, were all sitting in a group to one side of the council, and Merlin, who had commandeered a convenient ant-hill as his seat, now commanded attention by raising his staff. "What do you do?" he asked mildly. "When you want something valuable." "Take it," Agravain growled. Agravain commanded Arthur's heavy horsemen, leaving Arthur free to lead the whole army. "When you want something valuable from the gods," Merlin amended his question, "what do you do then?" Agravain shrugged, and none of the rest of us could supply an answer. Merlin stood so that his height dominated the council. "If you wish something," he said very simply, as though he was our teacher and we his pupils, "you must give something. You must make an offering, a sacrifice. The thing I wanted above all things in this world was the cauldron. So I offered my life to its search, and I received my wish. But if I had not offered my soul for it, the gift would not have come. We must sacrifice something." Murig's Christianity was offended, and he could not resist taunting the druid. "Your life, perhaps, Lord Merlin. It worked last time." He laughed and looked to his surviving priest to join the laughter. The laughter died as Merlin pointed his black staff at the prince. He kept the staff very still, its butt just inches from Murig's face, and he held it there long after the laughter had stopped. And still Merlin held the staff, stretching the silence unbearably. Agricola, feeling he must support his prince, cleared his throat, but a twitch of the black staff stilled whatever protest Agricola might have made. Murig wriggled uncomfortably, but seemed struck dumb. He reddened, blinked, and squirmed. Arthur frowned, but said nothing. Nimue smiled in anticipation of the prince's fate, while the rest of us watched in silence, and some of us shuddered in fear, and still Merlin did not move. Until at last, Murig could take the suspense no longer. "I was jesting," he almost shouted in desperation. "I meant no offense." "Did you say something, Lord Prince?" Merlin inquired anxiously, pretending Murig's panicked words had jolted him out of reverie. He lowered the staff. "I must have been daydreaming. Where was I? Oh, yes, a sacrifice. What do we have, Arthur, that is most precious?" Arthur thought for a few seconds. "We have gold," he said. "Silver. My armor." "Baubles," Merlin answered dismissively. There was silence for a while. Then men outside the council offered their answers. Some took torques from about their necks and waved them in the air. Others suggested offering weapons. One man even called out the name of Arthur's sword, Excalibur. The Christians made no suggestions, because this was a pagan procedure, and they would offer nothing but their prayers. But one man of Powys suggested we sacrifice a Christian, and that idea prompted loud cheers. Murig blushed again.
I sometimes think, Merlin said, when no more suggestions were offered, that I am doomed to live among idiots. Is all the world mad but me? Cannot one poor blinkered fool among you see what is plainly the most precious thing we possess? Not one?
Food, I said.
Ah! Merlin cried, delighted. Well done, you poor blinkered fool. Food, you idiots!
He spat the insult at the council.
Ael's plans are predicated upon the belief that we lack food. So we must demonstrate the opposite. We must waste food like Christians waste prayer. We must scatter it to the empty heavens. We must squander it. We must throw it away. We must.
He paused to put stress on the next word.
Sacrifice it.
He waited for a voice to be raised in opposition, but no one spoke.
Find a place near here, Merlin ordered Arthur, where you will be content to offer Ael battle. Do not make it too strong, for you don't want him to refuse combat. You're tempting him, remember, and you must make him believe he can defeat you. How long will it take him to ready his forces for battle?
3 days, Arthur said. He suspected that Ael's men were widely scattered in their loose ring that escorted us, and it would take the Saxon at least 2 days to shrink that ring into a compact army, and another full day to shove it into battle order.
I shall need 2 days, Merlin said. So bake enough hard bread to keep us barely alive for 5 days, he ordered. Not a generous ration, Arthur, for our sacrifice has to be real. Then find your battleground and wait. Leave the rest to me. But I want Derval and a dozen of his men to do some labouring work. And do we have any men here?
He raised his voice so that all the men crowding about the council could hear.
Who have skills in carving wood?
He chose 6 men. 2 were from Powys. 1 bore the hawk of Kernau on his shield, and the others were from Dumnonia. They were given axes and knives, but nothing to carve until Arthur had discovered his battleground. He found it on a wide heath that rose to a gentle summit, crowned by a scattered grove of yew and whitebeam. The slope was nowhere steep, but we would still have the high ground, and there Arthur planted his banners, and round the banners there grew an encampment of thatched shelters made from branches cut from the grove. Our spearmen would make a ring about the banners, and there we hoped face Ael. The bread that would keep us alive as we waited for the Saxons was baked in turf ovens. Merlin chose his spot to the north of the heath. There was a meadow there, a place of stunted alders and rank grass, edging a stream that curled south towards the distant Thames. My men were ordered to fell 3 oaks, then strip the trunks of their branches and bark, and afterwards dig 3 pits, into which the oaks could be set up as columns. Though first he ordered his 6 carvers to make the oak trunks into 3 ghoulish idols. Eorwith helped Nimue and Merlin, and the 3 loved that work, for it allowed them to devise the most ghastly, fearsome things that bore small resemblance to any god I had ever known. But Merlin did not care. The idols, he said, were not for us, but for the Saxons. And so he and his woodcarvers made 3 things of horror, with animal faces, female breasts, and male genitalia. And when the columns were finished, my men stopped their other work and hoisted the 3 figures into their pits, while Merlin and the woodcarvers tamped their bases with earth, so that at last the columns stood upright. "The Father," Merlin capered in front of the idols, "the Son, and the Holy Ghost," he laughed. My men, meanwhile, had been making a great stack of wood in front of the pits, and onto that wood we now piled what remained of our food. We killed the remaining oxen, and heaved their heavy corpses onto the pile, so that their fresh blood trickled down through the layers of timber, and onto the oxen we heaped everything they had hauled: dried meat, dried fish, cheese, apples, grain, and beans. And on top of those precious supplies, we put the carcasses of 2 newly caught deer and a freshly slaughtered ram. The ram's head, with its twin horns, was cut off and nailed to the central pillar. The The Saxons watched us work. They were on the stream's far bank, and once or twice, on the first day, their spears had hurtled over the water. But after those first futile efforts to interfere with us, they had been content to just watch and see exactly what strange things we did. I sensed that their numbers grew. On the first day, we had glimpsed only a dozen men among the far trees, but by the second evening, there were at least a score of fires smoking behind the leaf screen.
"Now," Merlin said that evening, "we give them something to watch."
We carried fire in cooking pots down from the heath's low summit to the great pile of wood, and thrust it deep into the tangle of branches. The wood was green, but we had stacked heaps of dry grass and broken twigs into the center, and by nightfall the fire was raging fiercely. The flames lit our crude idols with a lurid glare. The smoke boiled in a great plume that drifted towards London, and the smell of roasting meat wafted tantalizingly towards our hungry encampment. The fire crackled and collapsed, exploding streams of sparks into the air, and in its fierce heat, the dead beasts twitched and twisted as the flame shrank their sinews and exploded their skulls. Melting fat hissed in the blaze, then flared up white and bright to cast black shadows on the three hideous idols. All night that fire seethed, burning our last hopes of leaving Hrogir without victory. And in the dawn, we watched as the Saxons crept out to investigate its smoking remnants. Then we waited. We were not entirely passive. Our horsemen rode east to scout the London road, and came back to report bands of marching Saxons. Others of us cut timber and used it to begin constructing a hall beside the shrinking grove on the heath's summit. We had no need of such a hall, but Arthur wanted to give the impression that we were establishing a base deep in Hrogir, from which we would harass Eäl's lands. That belief, if it convinced Eäl, would surely provoke him to battle. We made the beginnings of an earthen rampart, but lacking the proper tools, we made a poor showing of the wall, though it must have helped the deception. We were busy enough, but that did not stop a rancorous division showing in the army. Some, like Murig, believed we'd adopted the wrong strategy from the start. It would have been better, Murig now said, if we had sent 3 or more smaller armies to take the Saxon fortresses on the frontier. We should have harassed and provoked, but instead we were growing ever hungrier in a self-made trap deep in Hrogir. Maybe he's right, Arthur confessed to me on the third morning. No, Lord, I insisted. And to prove my point, I gestured north, towards the wide smear of smoke that betrayed where a growing horde of Saxons was gathering beyond the stream. Arthur shook his head. Eäl's army is there, right enough, he said. But that doesn't mean he'll attack. They'll watch us. But if he has any sense, he'll let us rot here. We could attack him, I suggested. He shook his head. Leading an army through trees and across a stream is a recipe for disaster. That's our last resort, Derval. Just pray he comes today. But he did not come, and that was the end of the 5th day since the Saxons had destroyed our supplies. Tomorrow we would eat crumbs, and in 2 days more we would be ravenous. In 3, we would gaze defeat in its horrid eyes. Arthur displayed no concern, whatever doom the grumblers in the army suggested. And that evening, as the sun drifted down over distant Dumnonia, Arthur beckoned for me to climb and join him on the growing wall of our crudely constructed hall. I clambered up the logs and pulled myself onto the top of the wall. Look, he said, pointing east. And far off on the horizon, I could see another smear of grey smoke, and beneath the smoke, its buildings lit by the slanting sun, was a great town, bigger than any I had ever seen before, bigger than Glevum or Corinium, bigger even than Aquasulis. London, Arthur said in a tone of wonder. Did you ever think to see it? Yes, Lord. He smiled, My confident Derval Cadern.
He was perched on the wall's top, holding onto an untrimmed pillar and staring fixedly at the city. Behind us, in the rectangle of the hall's timbers, the army's horses were stabled. Those poor horses were already hungry, for there was little grass on the dry heathland, and we had brought no forage for them.
It's odd, isn't it?
Arthur said, still gazing at London.
That by now Lancelot and Cerdic could have done battle, and we'll know nothing about it.
Pray Lancelot won, I said.
I do, Derval. I do.
He kicked his heels against the half-built wall.
And what a chance Ael has, he said suddenly. He could cut down the best warriors of Britain here. By year's end, Derval, his men could hold our halls. They could stroll to the Seven Sea. All gone. All Britain. Gone.
He seemed to find the thought amusing. Then he twisted about and looked down at the horses.
We could always eat them, he said. Their meat will keep us alive for a week or two.
Lord, I protested at his pessimism.
Don't worry, Derval, he laughed. I've sent our old friend Ael a message.
You have?
Sagramor's woman. Mala, her name is. What odd names these Saxons have. You know her.
I've seen her, Lord. Mala was a tall girl with long, muscular legs and shoulders broad as a barrel. Sagramor had taken her captive in one of his raids late in the previous year, and she had evidently accepted her fate with a passivity that was reflected in her flat, almost vacant face that was surrounded by a mass of gold-coloured hair. Other than that hair, there was no one feature of Mala's that was particularly attractive. But somehow, she was still oddly alluring. A great, strong, slow, robust creature, with a calm grace and a demeanour as taciturn as her Numidian lover.
She's pretending to have escaped us, Arthur explained. And even now she should be telling Ael that we plan to stay here through the coming winter. She says Lancelot's coming to join us with another 300 spears, and that we need him here because a lot of our men are weak with sickness, despite our pits being filled with good food. He smiled. She's spinning endless nonsense to him. Or I hope she is.
Or maybe she's telling him the truth, I suggested gloomily.
Maybe.
He sounded unworried. He watched a line of men bringing skins of water from a spring that bubbled at the foot of the southern slope.
But Sagramor trusts her, he added. And I long ago learned to trust Sagramor.
I made the sign against evil. I wouldn't let my woman go to an enemy camp.
She volunteered, Arthur said. She says the Saxons won't harm her. It seems her father is one of their chiefs.
Pray she loves him less than she loves Sagramor. Arthur shrugged. The risk was taken now, and discussing it would not lessen its dangers. He changed the subject.
I want you in Dumnonia when all this is done.
Willingly, Lord. If you promise me Kynwyn will be safe, I answered. And when he tried to dismiss my fears with a wave of his hand, I persevered. I hear tales of a dog being killed, and its bloody pelt draped on a bitch. Arthur twisted about, swung his legs over the wall, and dropped down into the makeshift stables. He shoved a horse aside and beckoned for me to join him, where no man could see us or hear us. He was angry.
Tell me again what you hear, he commanded me.
That a dog was killed, I said when I had jumped down, and its bloody pelt was draped on a crippled bitch.
And who did that?
He demanded. A friend of Lancelot's, I answered, unwilling to name his wife. He struck a hand against the crude timber wall, startling the closest horses.
My wife, he said, is a friend to King Lancelot.
I said nothing.
As am I,
he challenged me, and still I said nothing.
He's a proud man, Derval, and he lost his father's kingdom because I failed in my oath. I owe him.
He said the last three words coldly. I matched his coldness with my own. I hear, I said, that the crippled bitch was given the name
Kynwyn. Enough! He slapped the wall again. Stories! Just stories. And no one denies there's resentment for what you and Kynwyn did, Derval. I'm not a fool. But I will not hear this nonsense from you. Guinevere attracts these rumors. People resent her. Any woman who is beautiful, who is clever, and who has hard opinions and isn't afraid to speak them attracts resentment. But are you saying she would work some filthy spell against Kynwyn? That she'd slaughter a dog and skin it? Do you believe that? I would like not to, I said. Guinevere is my wife. He had lowered his voice, but the tone was still bitter. I don't have other wives. I don't take slaves to my bed. I am hers, and she is mine, Derval. And I will not hear anything said against her. Nothing! He shouted that last word, and I wondered if he was remembering the filthy insults hurled by Gorfithid at Lugvale. Gorfithid had claimed to have bedded Guinevere, and claimed further that a whole legion of other men had bedded her as well. I remembered Valerin's lover's ring, cut by the cross and decorated with Guinevere's symbol, but I thrust the memories aside. Lord, I said quietly, I never mentioned your wife's name. He stared at me, and for a second I thought he was going to strike me. Then he shook his head. She can be difficult, Derval. There are times when I wish she was not so ready to show scorn. But I cannot imagine living without her advice. He paused and gave me a rueful smile. I cannot imagine living without her. She has killed no dogs, Derval. She has killed no dogs. Trust me, that goddess of hers, Isis, doesn't demand sacrifices. At least not of living things. Of gold, yes. He grinned, his good mood suddenly restored. Isis swallows gold. I believe you, Lord, I said. But that doesn't make Kynwyn safe. Dinas and Levane have threatened her. He shook his head. You hurt Lancelot, Derval. I don't blame you, for I know what drove you. But can you blame him for resenting you? And Dinas and Levane serve Lancelot, and it's only right that men should share their master's grudges. He paused. When this war is done, Derval, he went on, we shall make a reconciliation. All of us. When I make my band of warriors into brothers, we shall make peace between us all. You, Lancelot, and everyone. And until that happens, Derval, I swear Kynwyn's protection. On my life, if you insist. You can impose the oath, Derval. You can demand whatever price you want. My life, my son's life even, because I need you. Dumnonia needs you. Kiluk is a good man, but he can't manage Mordred. Can I asked. Mordred is willful. Arthur ignored my question. But what do we expect? He's Uther's grandson. He has the blood of kings, and we don't want him to be a milksop. But he does need discipline. He needs guidance. Kiluk thinks it's enough to hit him, but that just makes him more stubborn. I want you and Kynwyn to raise him. I shuddered. You make coming home ever more attractive, Lord. He scowled at my levity. Never forget, Derval, that our oath is to give Mordred his throne. That is why I came back to Britain. That is my first duty in Britain. And all who are sworn to me are sworn to that oath. No one said it would be easy, but it will be done. 9 years from now, we shall acclaim Mordred on Caer Cadern. On that day, Derval, we are all released from the oath. And I pray to every god who will listen to me, that on that day I will be able to hang up Excalibur and never fight again. But till that good day comes, whatever the difficulties, we shall cleave to our oath. Do you understand that? Yes, Lord, I said humbly. Good. Arthur pushed a horse aside. Ael will come tomorrow, he said confidently as he walked away. So sleep well. The sun sank over Dumnonia, drowning it in red fire. To the north, our enemy chanted war songs, and about our campfires we sang of home. Our sentinels gazed into the darkness. The horses whinnied, Merlin's dogs howled, and some of us slept. At dawn, we saw that